very much for the invitation. I really fit the new investigator part of the presentation. So my PhD has been in industrial engineering. I've been doing a lot of data over time, process monitoring type applications. And when I joined Auburn University, I had the pleasure to work with Deep South Center to really learn more about safety and how can we incorporate some of the data analytics tools into the safety domain. So I'm really grateful for the application, and it's been an honor to see the presentations before me. I've never been in a workshop that had a beer presentation and a bacon presentation the same day. So this is definitely a first for me. And I hope that you find this presentation as valuable and informative as I've seen the ones before me. So I'm talking about commercial vehicle safety, but with particular focus on trucks. So there is about 3.5 million truck drivers in the US right now. The trucking industry is really one of the main driving forces behind the US economy, because that's how the way we transfer goods in this country. There is about 4,800 fatalities that are related to trucking accidents that happen every year. And although this number has been decreasing if you looked at over the 10-15 year span, however, the number is still significantly high because most of these, if not all of these accidents, are really preventable. So that's one issue. And if we're talking about the economic cost to the kind of the US, it's estimated to be about $2 billion. So this was part of the motivation we started looking into this. This presentation is a presentation based on the PhD work of Yao-Te, Tsai, a PhD student in Auburn University, with collaboration with Steve Swartz, who's an associate professor in the business school. So when we started kind of framing the research, we started thinking about, when we did the literature search, we realized that there is really not too much about what is the implications of the interaction between public policy and safety outcomes in the context of trucks. Different to other operations, really state laws tend to define a lot how do you handle trucks and truck accidents. So for example, in Alabama, we have a commercial vehicle safety department. These are the people who are responsible to stop trucks on the highway. If you go to the neighboring Georgia, the Highway State Patrol, which stop regular vehicles, tend to stop these trucks. So we want to understand and communicate with public policy makers. If you're going to invest, whether in new policies or in investments in road maintenance, do they really actually make a difference based on a statistical analysis? So that really has been kind of the driving question behind our research. And as a new researcher to the area, the first question we started thinking about is how do we model the data? So we have data from different states, and really kind of where the research we do in Auburn fit is we start getting these disparate data sources. So we look at data from the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. We look at socio-economic factors that are collected by different agencies. And we really try to think, is there some interaction between them? So how do we model the data? And in order to model the data, we started really realizing that we really need to understand the assumptions we're making. So are these assumptions reasonable or not? So we started really looking a lot into data visualization to really try to understand the assumptions so that we can make a model. And we also started to look into data visualization in order to communicate the results of the models to people with varying degrees of background. So we're talking to truck drivers, we're talking to companies like J.B. Hunt, we're also talking to policymakers as well as safety engineers. So we need to figure out a common way to communicate our results to people who have different background. And then what are the implications of public policy on safety? So if we're comparing different states, how can we give advice that is reasonable based on the fatality rates that we've been seeing over the last 10 years? So since it's 3:45, I'm going to start by a question. This is the data we looked at. So I'm pretty sure Utah does a better job than Alabama. But if you're looking at Alabama's data, it's PDFs. This is kind of how we started looking at the data. What we're looking at is a snapshot for 1 month. We have 24 columns. These 24 columns correspond to the traffic flow going through I-85, which is one of the bigger interstates in the state. This is about 40 miles from Auburn University. And they do that for 30 days or for each month, and then that report is generated for for all the 12 months during the year. So our first question was, if we're gonna model seasonality in our data, if we're really trying to understand I-85 takes you to 65, so it takes you to the beach. So if you're going south on 85 from Auburn, we expect to see different seasonal patterns between the different seasons. So that's one question we wanted to really understand. How do we assess that? Another question we were really trying to look into, when you do statistical modeling, you know that your model is really as good as your assumptions. So when the PhD student started looking into some of this data, his first question was, well, we can just assume that Monday to Friday, we're going to have a certain pattern. And then on Saturday and Sunday, the weekends, we're going to have a different pattern. So my question to him was, why? He was like, that seems reasonable. People go to work Monday to Friday, and Saturday and Sunday, we should expect something different. So since there's a lot of new investigators like me in this room, how would you plot this data? So let's say you have 365 days worth of data, and you have 24 observations per day. This data is, you could think about it from a time series point of view. We're getting data over time, repeated in the same location. How do you plot that so that you're able to answer that question? Whether we have weekly type patterns, whether we have within day of the week type patterns, how do you make that visualization in order to communicate that? So I know it's late, and I'm not talking about bacon, so that's why I'm asking questions. Any suggestions?
So if I understand the question correctly, you're basically saying to us, we have a bunch of data thrown at us. How do we compile it into something so that we can make quick visual sense of it? Is that?
So quick visual sense in order to model it, yes.
So there's a couple things we can do. You generally use measures of things like extremes. So you can use things like highs. You can use medians or means. You can use lows.
So are we averaging during the day? So we're going to compact the data, say, within a day. We're going to have 24 measurements.
And each one of those things will tell you very, very different things.
Okay, so that could lead to 200 different visualizations.
Yeah.
So we wanted to really kind of shorten that. And one of the things we started looking was, we're going to let the data talk. So we used a primarily data-driven approach. We combined data mining, so for the people who are familiar with data mining and machine learning, with visualization for the purpose of trying to understand what is really happening with the data. So we used a clustering algorithm called k-means clustering. Based on our optimization results for minimizing the error, we've learned that the best fit for this data is having 8 different clusters. So in terms of our assumptions, we never really thought about 8. We thought every number from 2 to 7. So that was the first interesting observation. 2 is saying that we're going to have a weekend versus weekday effect. 7, you're going all the way to saying each day is different. So that was the first interesting observation. The second interesting observation is when we started, so on this side of the graph, so on your right, we're plotting on the y-axis, you're seeing the average traffic flow per cluster, so per each of these clusters. And on the x-axis, we have the 24 hours we're looking at. So the cluster which first stuck to us was that blue one. It had a very different pattern. It peaks around 10 a.m. and then it goes down. We don't see that 5 p.m. peak or 4 to 6 p.m. peak that we've seen with the rest of the data. And on the calendar, we plotted the days that really corresponded to the data in this cluster. So that was interesting because it was only 5 days. So when we're looking at this data, we realized these are 5 days in the fall that were all Saturdays. So that was kind of the first question. So when we really looked into it, we did realize that that was the impact of Auburn games when we played before 2 p.m. On traffic. So these were the people who were coming from Mobile and coming from Montgomery to see Auburn play football during these 5 days. So that season, Auburn had 8 games, but the remaining 3 games, the games were later. Were night games, so we're playing either 7 or 8 o'clock. So that was the impact of football on traffic, which was something that we obviously couldn't really guess beforehand. And then when we started looking at some of the other data, we started seeing that, it's very interesting. So if we're trying to say what happened on Thanksgiving, how do we model Thanksgiving? How do we model Christmas? the day before Christmas. So when you start thinking about this type of data, you're going to make some assumption that is not necessarily justified by the data. But based on our model, we started realizing that a lot of these days really follow typical Fridays. So we've seen a lot of, so this is the day before Thanksgiving, this is Friday. We're seeing that traffic where you have a later traffic, people tend to drive a little bit later, more people are off from work, and maybe more people are traveling to see relatives and friends. So these are things that we could have assumed or not have necessarily thought about, and that's something we learned from the data. So the purpose of that is if you're modeling traffic data and you're looking at accidents per hour, and there is a lot of metrics that looks into how many accidents have we seen per 100 million miles driven in trucking. So how do you really accommodate for the different durations, the different locations? And that's something we could really learn by visualizing data in new ways. So from that, we came up with an Excel-based tool which has that visualization. You could use it for anything which is not traffic. So if you have data that is repetitive over the day, and that data repeats over long periods of time, you could really use some data mining ways to really visualize the data and relate it to your calendar. And really, instead of saying, I'm assuming a certain time series model, to really start understanding the patterns that are behind this data. We also looked into a mapping feature, and the mapping feature is not necessarily new, but if we're going to give a tool for practitioners just to use Excel, we're not asking them to use R, we're not asking them to use SPSS or SAS, we're just a very simple tool. Put your data in, and we're going to give you a visualization. So we wanted to understand if there is a difference in accidents when we're looking at, by combining population data in a given state or in a given location with accidents, with day of the week, how can we visualize 5 or 6 variables in one visualization? And then the third aspect was, I know that we don't have any lawyers in the room. Okay, awesome. So I can make a lawyer joke then. So because we don't have any lawyers in the room, if you're really trying to communicate to a lawyer, my p-value was 0.02. This is like as if you're talking in Arabic. I can make fun of me. Yeah? So you're speaking in Arabic and trying to explain Dr. Sasek a concept about safety. So he would have no idea what I'm talking about, but he's going to trust me that I'm telling him something reasonable. So we were trying to communicate some of these statistical methods to essentially people who are not very familiar with the analysis, and really how do we communicate that in an easy way so that they understand. So we kind of did a small video to show you some of the aspects of the tool. We're just going to show the visual implication. You can pick the dates, the date range for the data you want to plot. And the idea here is not that this is new, but really combining these in order to either communicate results from your model, which is a very important step that we miss as engineers. We always talk in our own language. So how do we communicate to people in a different language, in their own terms? When I teach, I always tell people, explain it in plain English. So that's kind of our plain English explanation. Or how do we do it in such, and then you can pull, and you're doing filters. So instead of telling them, you know, how do you code these different filters, we are kind of getting that from the column headers, and by looking at whether this is a continuous variable or a discrete variable, we're able to do these filters automatically for them, and then they could kind of visualize what the data is telling them. 3 minutes, okay. So this is kind of looking at the distracted driving law in 12 southern eastern states. So Alabama, Florida, and South Carolina didn't implement the law until January of 2012, so we didn't really take that data into account. But we could visualize that data just using smiley faces, a very simple explanation. If you are in Georgia, that distracted driving law was kind of, it showed some potential based on the data. We're only looking at fatalities, so if we're looking at maybe number of accidents, the results might be different. In some other states, we don't really, maybe in Arkansas, that result has not been very significant. So for communicating, just doing a simple t-test, how do we communicate this result looking at a 3-year before and 3-year after type data? So since I only have 2 minutes now, the second part of the research really looked into what is the impact of demographic factors, socio-economic factors on highway safety research? And we tried to answer some of these questions by doing a simple statistical model. So we did a panel data analysis where we had data per each state, and that data was repeated over a period of time. We looked at 7 drivers. One was education. The other was new insurance, new car registration, kind of the living cost, unemployment rate, and the law, the distracted lighting law, as well as seatbelt use. And by doing this model, we actually realized that our hypothesis for education was, as you increase your education rates and graduation rates, you should see people driving more safer on the highway. That was our hypothesis. For the lack of insurance, we thought that if you're going to have people with no insurance, then they might not be driving as much. So that should be an increase in that should be associated with an increase with a decrease in accidents. New car registration, we thought if you're having more newer cars on the road, our hypothesis was you should have less fatalities. They have better safety features, so you should have less fatalities. And unemployment, the literature suggested that as the employment rate went up, you had less car accidents, less fatalities, because people are not driving as much, which made sense. So our results actually indicated that we didn't see that the distracted driving law overall made an impact on the fatalities per 100 million miles driven. So that's something we didn't see in truck drivers. We saw that as the education level went up, as the unemployment rate went up, as road maintenance costs went up, so the state is spending more money to improve its highway system, these were associated with a lower fatality rate. As new vehicle registration went up, we've seen higher fatalities. And as the number of seatbelt tickets went up, we've seen also higher fatalities, which didn't really make sense. We're not really sure why that is. So our questions for policymakers, and we did publish that it got accepted to the Journal of Transportation Law, Logistics, and Policy. What we're talking to this community is, okay, so we really need to start thinking about what does that really mean? So if I'm a state official, and I know that education has to do with higher deaths on the highway, how do we address that? And these are the kind of questions that these type of models allow us to answer. We're not here to really provide answers, but we're really here to communicate what the data tells us. So I'm just going to end up by kind of highlighting something we're working on for the future. We're right now in the process of talking with several trucking companies, including JB Hunt, looking into developing a new cruise control system that allows them to do something I learned from the first presentation. So when you were saying what we try to do in ergonomics, one of them was we're trying to make people safer, and another 2 goals had to do with efficiency and better quality. So this is what we're trying to do with this adaptive cruise controller. We're trying to sell it to trucking companies. It's going to make your drivers safer, but it's also going to cut your gas consumption by 10%. And the math behind that exists, and we have the data. So I'm just going to let you, this is some of the future research we're doing with Auburn. I'm really, really grateful for the Deep South Center. Without their help and support and the faculty's support, I definitely wouldn't be standing here knowing my 2% that I know about truck safety. So that's something I really appreciate, and I really appreciate my colleagues who, as a young assistant professor, they've taken every day to mentor and help me be a better researcher and better mentor for our PhD students. Thank you very much. We have time for one question. Anybody have a question?
So why 8 clusters?
That was the result that minimized the error from the data. So when we
use expectation maximization to find those clusters?
Yes. So we looked into how do we minimize the error associated with the separability in the clusters, and that was based on 8. So we varied that from 2 to 15, and 8 was kind of the optimal result in that. But honestly, that when we looked at different years, the number changed, and that was probably due to a change in driving pattern from year to year, which is something we expect.
Or maybe you should try to get the number of clusters using expectation maximization.
Yeah, and we could use a number of different methods. I mean, our main takeaway here was not necessarily what data mining algorithm you're using. You're going to end up potentially with either different results or close results.
Does it still stand out if you use a different
We didn't look into that. Yeah, it could be something else. But for us, the main takeaway was that you could really learn from the data by using a data-driven approach. And you start asking, and that's the important part, you're going to ask questions that you were not possibly able to answer before. So I was not going to be able to think about what we're going to do with Christmas, the day after Christmas, the day before Christmas. But if you let the data talk to you, that's something that you could potentially be able to model or account for.
So is there any last questions after you visualize the data, or the last questions before you go on?
In this situation, we were hoping to uncover trends post-visualization. So this was an exploratory data analysis kind of technique that we're doing. So we went into there with no assumptions. Sometimes the visualization could be in order to answer the third question, but this one was to understand the patterns.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Tom is a way better presenter, and he's even more fun.
Boy, is he.
I'm happy that he's the last guy, because I don't want to be the last guy.
Yes,
The last presentation today is going to be Tom Fadel. He's going to talk to us about